Hello, everybody. My name is Pablo Boczkowski, and I'm a faculty member at Northwestern University and director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media. Thank you so much for joining us for today's weekly virtual seminar of the Center. It's really a pleasure to have you with us today. The mission of the Center is to create knowledge about digital media in Latinx and Latin American communities across the Americas. Today's speaker is a leading scholar in this space. Ulises Mejias is professor and director of the Institute for Global Engagement at SUNY Oswego. Tomás Guarna, a graduate student at MIT and an affiliate at the Center for Latinx Digital Media, will introduce Ulises in just a minute. I'm delighted to note that today's talk is co-sponsored by the Alice Kaplan Institute for the Humanities, the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Center for Global Culture and Communication, the Department of Communication Studies, the Department of Radio, Television, and Film, the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Program, and the Latina and Latino Studies Program. But before we go into the seminar, I would like to start by acknowledging that Northwestern is a community of learners situated within a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. It is also in close proximity to an urban Native American community in Chicago and near several tribes in the Midwest. The Northwestern campus sits on the traditional homelands of the people of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, as well as the Menominee, Miami, and Ho-Chunk nations. It was also a site of trade, travel, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other native tribes and is still home to over 100,000 tribal members in the state of Illinois. It is within Northwestern's responsibility as an academic institution to disseminate knowledge about Native peoples and the institution's history with them. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity and inclusion, Northwestern works towards building relationships with Native American communities through academic pursuits, partnerships, historical recognitions, community service, and enrollment efforts. Let me say briefly about how the seminar will unfold. First, Tomás will tell us more about Ulises' research and career in just a minute. Then Ulises will deliver his seminar. After that, we will open for questions. Please enter your questions in the Q&A function of the webinar. Tomás will moderate. At the end, we will deliver some closing remarks. Once again, many thanks for joining us, and without further ado, Tomás, the screen is all yours.
Thank you, Professor Boczkowski. And it's a pleasure for me to introduce Ulises Mejias, professor at State University of New York at Oswego, and the director of its Institute for Global Engagement. Professor Mejias is a key voice in issues of data colonialism and platform capitalism. His latest book, The Cause of Connection, co-authored by Nick Coldry, is a thorough exploration of how technological companies quantify life for profit and social control, an essential reading for those interested in critiquing contemporary capitalism and imagining new possibilities. As a publicly engaged scholar, Professor Mejias co-founded Tierra Común, a collective of activists, journalists, and scholars that contest datacolonialism, as well as the Nonaligned Technologies movement. The impact of his scholarship is in that same direction. His contributions have become part of the lexicon of scholars in fields like critical internet studies and social studies of data, but also constantly prove their capacity to inform media practitioners and policymakers. So please join me in welcoming Professor Mejias.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start sharing my screen at this moment so you can see my slides. Okay, so you should be seeing this now. I want to start just by thanking the organizers and Pablo Mora in particular for all their help. This has been an extremely well organized invitation and event, so thank you very much. Facundo and Tomás as well for your support. So I'm going to talk for about 35-40 minutes. That's the plan. As all of you, I find this Zoom format a little bit challenging. I wish we could be in person so that I could engage in these discussions with you, but we'll do our best. Please ask lots of questions so that I don't feel I'm speaking to empty space. Okay. I'm going to be talking a lot about data colonialism, obviously, but I want to start by highlighting the fact that colonialism has always depended on data, even before the digital era. So if we think, for instance, about maps and surveys that colonizers used to map and manage new territories, obviously all of those relied on data. Even if we think about passports as instruments for controlling the movement of populations in colonies, as well as in the centers of empire, obviously those relied on data as well. If we think even about plantation spreadsheets, like the one you see to the left there, obviously this is before the era of Excel. So these were paper representations that were used to manage haciendas, to manage plantations. In this particular example that you see here, to track slaves and how much they cost and the cost associated with them. All of that requires collection and management of data as well. More related to what we're experiencing these days, if we think about vaccination and vaccination cards, again, as instruments to control the movement of not safe bodies that are not pure. Obviously, in the context of settler colonialism, were important tools of colonialism itself. Even if we think just generally about census data in colonialism, particularly the kind of data that allowed the colonizers to set up plague colonies, if we're talking about pandemics as well, such as the example that I have here in the background of Johannesburg in 1901, when plague colonies were set after the Spanish flu arrived. So again, all of this requires data. And just lastly, if we think about forensics or policing data, for instance, the invention of fingerprinting technology, which was developed in India by the British, and which then was exported to the rest of the empire. Or even phenotype guides as early forms, perhaps, of facial recognition. I have one there on the right, used by the Soviet Union to manage, again, populations, which I don't know, it might be too small for you to see, but this was a guide to recognize the faces, for instance, of Jewish people, of gypsies, and of course of subjects from Central Asian territories. So I think it's pretty clear that colonialism has always then depended on data. Now, if data has always been an instrument of colonialism, we could be excused, perhaps, for seeing the colonized as mere victims or subjects of the colonizers' technology. But I think it's actually a bit more complicated than that. And so, for instance, when I think about my own role in data colonialism, I think of myself not just as a passive subject, but as a full participant in this new form of colonialism. Perhaps something like a native informant, like the example that I'm going to discuss here of La Malinche, also known as Malintzin and by other names. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this figure, but she was actually a slave woman that was given to Hernan Cortés as he arrived to what is now known as Mexico. From the records, documents, narratives that we have, she was an extremely smart woman. She was basically acting as an interpreter because she could speak Spanish and local languages. But she became more than that, right? She was an advisor to Hernan Cortés and the Spaniards. She was an intermediary of sorts. In other words, she wasn't a passive colonial subject. She wasn't just merely a victim. Because of that, of course, in our histories as Latinx people, many times she's also represented as a traitor, right? As someone who collaborated with the Spaniards to facilitate the enterprise of colonialism. And of course, it's a very complicated relationship, right? Because even though she's seen as an active subject, as a traitor, at the end of the day, she's also the mother of the raza, of Latinx people. It is through this union of an indigenous woman and a European man that we have mestizos, that we have Latin Americans. So I think this figure of the native informant is very interesting for me. The figure of the native informant, there's different definitions. I have here something from Spivak, from her writing, A Critique of Postcolonial Reason, where she says the native informant is a figure who in ethnography can only provide data. That's their role, to provide data that can be interpreted by the knowing subject for reading. So the colonizer has this privileged position as the one who can actually read. And the native informant supplies the data to that can actually be read. In some ways, if we think of ourselves as native informants in this new era, digital era, we are informing on ourselves, right? The colony is our social life. The platform is the metropolis. So I think we're playing this active role in many ways in this thing we're calling datacolonialism. In some ways, yes, we are also traders, perhaps. We're also betraying ourselves. We're exchanging something very valuable for trinkets, right? Just like the narrative of indigenous people exchanging gold for trinkets. That something very valuable is, of course, information about our social lives, data. Many of these ideas, as was already mentioned, come from my book, The Cost of Connection, which I have written with my colleague, Nick Coldry. Here it is. You can find it wherever books are sold, as they say. But this book is essentially about data colonialism. So what I want to do now is give you our official formal definition of data colonialism. So we say that it is an emerging order for the appropriation of human life so that data can be continuously extracted from it for profit. Key word there, for profit, because we don't think all forms of data are bad and all uses of data are bad. We're specifically talking about the extraction of data from social life for profit. A central point here is then that the way we're using the word colonialism is not as a metaphor, is not as an allegory. We are talking about an emergent reality. Something that just as colonialism was necessary to basically finance the emergence of industrial capitalism, we're arguing that we're about to see a very similar process. This extraction resulting in the accumulation of wealth that will shape the world in consequential ways. Now, when we say this, of course, one initial question, common question is, where's the violence? Because I think when we think of colonialism, all of us associate it with a very particular kind of brutal violence. And so you might ask then, where is the violence here? If you're talking about a new form of colonialism, where is the violence? And so to begin to answer that question, I just want to briefly touch on the difference between colonialism and coloniality, which is a concept developed by the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano. Now, his point was simply that, yes, in some ways, colonialism is over. Of course, it depends who you ask. We can ask our friends in Puerto Rico or Samoa or Palestine. Maybe from their perspective, colonialism is not over. But by and large, colonies got their independence. Quijano's point, however, is that the legacy of colonialism continues. And it continues to shape our lives. It continues to shape power relations, politics, continues to shape how knowledge is structured. So that's why we can continue to talk about this legacy, these continuities. So what Nick and I are saying is that, yes, there are differences between historical colonialism and data colonialism. There are differences in terms of modes, intensities. There are differences in terms of the scales and the context So that's why we're not saying it's a one-to-one comparison and we can expect to see the same level of violence. We're saying there are those differences, but there are also similarities. One important similarity is the historical function in colonialism of yesterday and today's data colonialism. The historical function is the same, and then function is to dispossess, to extract. So we do realize that using this word and this concept of colonialism is risky because it's a loaded term and it brings up a lot of associations and memories, perhaps. So in order to justify our use, let me kind of summarize some of what we see as the benefits of applying this model of data colonialism. To begin with, we think there are benefits of scope and scale. Just in terms of scale, using the framework of data colonialism allows us to think or to talk about 500 years, not just 4 decades of perhaps the emergence of the internet, etc. We can put these things in a much longer context, larger context, and we can see data as this new historical form of resource extraction that, like I mentioned earlier, builds the foundations for the next stage of capitalism. Just like plantations financed factories 200 years ago. There's also, I think, a benefit of using the data colonialism framework in terms of the scope, because we can talk about social media. And I think a lot of the critiques that we see these days are centered on the extractivism carried out through social media. But we can also talk about other things like surveillance. We can talk about the gig economy. We can talk about perhaps logistics, how the processes for getting goods to our homes when we order something from Amazon, how all of that also depends on all this data extraction. We can even think about internal corporate data. So all of these companies that are producing smart devices and capturing information from us that is then just used internally. We might not even get to see it, but we can discuss this within this same framework. And there are also, I think, benefits when it comes to issues of discussing force and order. Data colonialism allows us to then speak about this new social order, to talk about the emerging forms of dependency and rule based on things that we all like convenience, like customization. But on those things also reinforce older inequalities that have deep colonial roots in terms of the inequalities of class, gender, and race, as we are learning more and more. Even in data colonialism, some populations end up paying a heavier price. And those populations are the same as in colonialism, of course. And lastly, I think by employing this model, we can think of big data as a continuation of the West's long-term attempt to impose a single version of rationality in the world. And this rationality is precisely of that of data extraction. So those are some of the benefits. Let me just give you a quick example of then what we mean in the book by the coloniality of data relations. And what we do in the book is we conduct basically various forms of transhistorical analysis, using the colonial past to try to understand what is happening in the present. And we organize these transhistorical comparisons in terms of the game plan we use when we play strategy video games. Those strategies are the 4X model: explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. These are the same strategies, by the way, you apply in a strategy video game like the one you see in the background here, which is part of the Sid Meier's Civilization series. This is Colonialism, the video game. In the game, you can play the British, the French, the Spanish, and the Portuguese, or the Dutch, I don't remember. And basically, your goal is to colonize the world by applying these 4 strategies. The natives and their lands and their resources are controlled by the computer. They're not even sentient players. And so you apply these strategies to win the game. You explore, expand, exploit, and exterminate. So we use these as organizational devices in the book. And right now I don't have time to discuss all of them, so I'll just focus on one: explore. And what I want to do here is compare basically 2 historical documents. The first one you see here is the terms of use of Google Chrome. So when you install Google Chrome, as it says here, in case you haven't read the terms of use, like most of us have not, you give Google a perpetual, irrevocable, worldwide, royalty-free, and non-exclusive license to reproduce, adapt, modify, translate, publish, publicly perform, publicly display, and distribute any content which you submit, post, or display on or through the services. So, in other words, when we install Google Chrome, we give Google permission to do all of this, which is a lot. We surrender a lot. I want to compare this with a much older document. This document is called the Requerimiento, the demand or the requirement in Spanish. This was a document that Spanish colonizers read when they arrived to a new village, city that they were going to invade in the so-called New World. Sometimes they would arrive in the dead of night under cover of darkness, and they would stand outside the village and proceed to read this document in Spanish to a population that obviously did not speak Spanish. The document said in part, but if you do not submit to Spanish rule, in other words, I certify to you that with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the church and of their highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highnesses may command. And we shall take away your goods and shall do all the mischief and damage that we can. That's the Spanish Requerimiento 1513. Please click accept and install there. So the point is not to suggest that what happens after we install Chrome is the same thing that happened after the Requerimiento was read. Rather, the point here is to call attention to the use of this abstract, incomprehensible language to carry out the initial trick of dispossession. This is exchange of gold for trinkets. Part of the reason this new system is so effective is because it is based on old rationalities with a deep colonial past. So the old rationalities continue to influence the new rationalities that are presented to explain this emerging social system. Let's start with cheap nature. In order to colonize the world, nature had to be framed as cheap. It was said to be abundant. It was said to be free. From a legal perspective, it was said to be without an owner, at least a civilized owner. That's why we have the concept of terra nullius, which in Latin means no man's land. The colonizer was able to arrive and declare these no man's land, even though they were inhabited, because the men there were not fully civilized. From cheap nature, we then transition to cheap labor. And here, again, in colonialism, some humans were determined, of course, by their race. They were assigned the role of providing the labor required to transform nature into wealth. So exploitation and abuse are thus framed as social progress. We're told that colonialism is for the good of humanity, and the atrocities that may come with it are also for our own good. So we transition from cheap nature to cheap labor, to now what we have is cheap data. And we can see some of the same extractive rationalities, right, that we saw in the case of nature and labor. Cheap data is again said to be abundant. It's just there for the taking. It doesn't have an owner, at least in its aggregate form, because it needs processing through advanced technology. So our only job is to generate it. The corporations are the ones who have the means to transform it, like oil, from a natural resource to something that humanity can benefit from. And that's why we're told that this, again, is what progress looks like. Just want to check my time. Okay. So how do we begin to resist this system? How do we resist data colonialism? To answer that question, I just want to touch quickly on two concepts from my earlier work on critical network theory, which were published in my book, Of the Network, that came out in 2013. So let's start with a standard image of a network, which, as you know, is composed of two things. In a network, we have nodes and we have links connecting those nodes. So if two nodes are part of the same network, the distance between them is finite. That's why we have 6 degrees of separation or whatever. You can connect any two people on Facebook through friends of friends. But because they're part of the same network, we can link them. Meanwhile, however, the distance between something that is on the network and something that is not on the network is, for all practical purposes, infinite. And this is a phenomenon I call nodocentrism. So networks are kind of filters, in other words, that only see nodes. If something is not a node on the network, it is, for all practical purposes, invisible. It might as well not exist. That's why if I'm visiting Chicago and I'm looking for Mexican restaurants on Google Maps, if the restaurant 2 blocks over is not indexed by Google, it might as well not exist. I'm not aware of its place in the network. So nodocentrism refers to this reality in which nodes can only see other nodes, and only nodes deserve to be accounted for. So it is a form of epistemological exclusivity that discriminates against anything that is not a node and is not part of the network. Which brings us to the second concept I want to briefly touch on. And for that, again, I take you to this image of the network. Nodes connected by links, by those little lines. But now I want you to basically shift your attention, not from the circles and the lines, but to the spaces between those circles and lines. Because I argue that this space is far from barren or empty. The space around the nodes is not indeed empty. It is inhabited by what does not conform to the organizing logic of the network. And I call this space the paranodal. The paranodal might be, to use Rancière's terminology, the part of those who have no part. That's Jacques Rancière, a French philosopher. But the paranodal is not passive or subordinate. In fact, this space that the paranodal occupies is very important because it is the peripheries of the network that represent the spaces, the only subversive sites or spaces from which we can unthink or disidentify from the network. Social progress, in many instances, the formation of new social identities requires this kind of experimentation, this kind of space where we can experiment. So the paranodal allows basically from deviation from the prevailing norms of network logic. Which brings us to the proposal for a non-aligned technology movement, which is something I've been thinking about with colleagues from the network Tierra Común, in particular with Juan Ortiz-Froehler, who's been, also thinking along some of these lines. The question here is, yes, how do we create an activist movement to resist data colonialism? Should local responses to data colonialism be linked to global responses? And what can we learn from past responses to colonialism? Of course, this non-aligned technology movement is based on an earlier, original non-aligned movement, which again, I don't know if you're familiar with, but basically this was a response during the Cold War. A group of nations from the global South got together and they said, we don't want to align ourselves with capitalism or with communism. We want to create our own alternatives, a third way. All of this thinking started in a conference in Bandung in 1955, but the first non-aligned movement conference took place in Belgrade in 1961. The non-aligned movement had or has 120 member states, including all of the nations of Africa, 17 observer states, 10 international organizations are part of it. But as you can see, even from this earlier program for the conference, the focus is on the state and on heads of states as the main actors. Yes. They came up with some interesting proposals. For instance, in 1973, the non-aligned movement issued a new international information order. So even back then, before the internet proper, these nations were thinking about how do we create our own information order outside of capitalism and communism. Now, you might be thinking, well, I haven't heard about this recently, so what happened to it? Was the non-aligned movement just a failure? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on who you ask, but I think what's important is that we can learn from those models and those lessons. So the way we see the non-aligned technologies movement is also as a way to say no to, on the one hand, Silicon Valley and its model of profit generation, and on the other hand, the Chinese Communist Party and its model of using data to control populations. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but just another line of thinking that I've done in this area is to think about nationalization as a response to colonialism. And so here we have, of course, the example of when Mexico nationalized its oil, much to the discontent of the United States and the Dutch and the British and the French. I think the only reason Mexico was allowed to get away with this was because World War II was starting. So I think those countries had other things to preoccupy them. But Mexico basically said, this is a national resource. It belongs to us. It belongs to the nation and its citizens. So elsewhere, I've written about, mostly just as an exercise in imagination, what would it take to nationalize data? Should the global South nationalize its data? So I have an op-ed in Al Jazeera that you're free to consult, but basically where I argue that yes, what would happen if we declare data a national resource and we say this is a resource that should benefit its citizens? So Facebook, Google, Amazon, etc., you have to start paying for the privilege of using this resource. And there have been other proposals, of course, to pay us for our data. But I think this proposal sort of imagines that instead of paying individuals, we should collectively pool those resources at the national level so that we can do, we can tackle bigger projects with that wealth. Anyway, so we're talking about the non-aligned technologies movement and what that might look like. NATEM, as I call it, is a work in progress. It's very new. We're just sort of getting together members. And we haven't even agreed on the principles that should guide our work. So, but if we just kind of think about how it might look like, of course, we could have non-aligned infrastructures. We can think about non-aligned apps or non-aligned platforms, non-aligned search engines. We already have some of these technologies. So I think maybe the issue is how do we collectively, decide which ones to use and support each other in using them. We can talk about non-aligned data. For instance, could we have non-aligned health data or economic data or social data? Data that doesn't belong to a corporation or even just a state, maybe that civil society has a more active role in collecting and benefiting from. We can think about non-aligned organizations, perhaps non-aligned cities. What would that look like? Non-aligned universities or departments, non-aligned nations, perhaps thinking big picture down the road. Although I think the city is perhaps a good place to start. Personally, I think cities in the global south could become non-aligned first. And we can also think about the non-aligned forms of collective knowledge. So this is where we would have the decolonial theories and practices, the techno-feminisms, what I called algorithm observatories, sort of citizen science projects for monitoring, keeping track, and educating people on the algorithms of big social media platforms, for instance. We've talked about even more creative proposals, such as the theater of the oppressed by data. So I think the point here is that non-alignment could look many different ways, and we could issue many different proposals for that. But just to wrap up the talk, I want to discuss what the principles of non-alignment and decolonization could look like. And of course, like I said, we just started this movement. We haven't even agreed on principles ourselves. So this is just my own interpretation and what it looks like from my perspective. I think the principles of non-alignment could revolve around strategies that other movements struggling against settled colonialism and environmental destruction have already had success in applying. So this is where strategies could include boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Boycott perhaps in terms of opting out individually, divestment perhaps in terms of opting out organizationally, getting our schools to not use Google products, for instance, which I realize these days sounds quite difficult to achieve. And then, yes, in terms of sanctions, perhaps thinking about nationalizing, municipalizing data, things that I've already discussed. These strategies, like I said, have already been tried and have already been successful. So I think perhaps a non-aligned movement could also build on that. But the strategies of BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, need to be supplemented, I think, with other strategies that sort of broaden the scope of the activism. And so, in other words, we need also to think about knowledge, culture, and solidarity. In terms of knowledge, I think we need to rely on one of the most powerful weapons in the decolonial struggle, and that weapon is imagination. Imagination as a decolonial tool. Because even when colonialism could not be resisted with bodies, it could always be resisted with the mind. In terms of culture, I think we can apply the knowledge that comes with that imagination to help us figure out what tools of data colonialism we can appropriate and we can reimagine, and which ones we need to reject. That is, in essence, I think, the question that Audre Lorde posed to us, whether the master's tools can dismantle the master's house. I think to a certain extent they can, but only to a certain limit. After that, I think we need to develop our own tools, and that is, in fact, the creation of culture. Finally, if we need to establish connections with other non-aligned parties, I think that's where solidarity comes in. Establishing those links that respect our own diversity and difference, but that also unite us against our common enemies. Perhaps there's something useful in the old cliche of acting globally. Decolonizing data needs to be a cultural project that is at once aligned with our community's goals of freedom, of justice, but also aligned against the goals of extractivist corporations and states. Aligned, in other words, with the non-aligned across the world. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop there, and I hope we have plenty of time for questions.
Great. Thank you so much for that amazing talk. And thank you also for bringing up Audre Lorde's quote. And my first question, I'm going to take the privilege of taking the first question, was why focus on nation-based solutions and not just wait for the market to come up with solutions that respond to those boycotts and divestments?
Thank you, Tomas. That's a great question. And I alluded a little bit to it when I talked about nationalization, because I think there is a way in which a neoliberal proposal would say, you know, yes, we need to pay individuals for data, so let's start with that, with the individual. Because, you know, in Western epistemology, that's the basic unit, right? And in neoliberalism, I think we also think that, you know, if we address it at the level of the individual, then our job is done. We don't need to care about larger social pictures. Now, like I said, when I talk about nationalization, I fully realize that that's a problematic proposal. Nationalization historically solved some issues, but didn't solve others. I don't need to tell you or people from the global South that it resulted in the enrichment of certain elites. So it's not like the, you know, by nationalizing, for instance, oil, all of that wealth went to the average Mexican citizen. Perhaps in some ways it did, but it also served to make the rich in those countries richer and the poor, in fact, poorer. So I'm not suggesting this as a magic bullet. And I think the role of the state needs to be problematized. However, at this historical junction, I think we cannot ignore the role of the state. In fact, colonialism has always been a partnership between states and corporations. And I do think, like I said, at this juncture, we do need to consider what partnerships we are going to have to form with governments so that we can put pressure on them, so that we can provide visions for how we think the marketplace should be regulated. So I'm certainly not offering the nation state as a magical solution. And even I think, as we can see in the case of my own country, Mexico, even with a leftist government as we currently have, there are many issues that still need to be addressed and solved, including sexism. So I'm not presenting certainly the framework of the nation as a wonder solution, but I do think we need to address it.
Would you be optimistic about civil society as a way of channeling this?
Well, I think we have to be optimistic. I think I personally am optimistic. I also think we need to try lots of different solutions. And if we're going to partner with the public sector, I think some sort of dialogue with the private sector is also necessary. So I myself, yes, for instance, when we think about the Nonaligned Technology movement, we have been intentionally not applying for grants from big corporations to come and support us, because I think it needs to be a grassroots movement that is independent. But I do think we need to be able to talk to the corporations as well as to the governments. And I'm optimistic in what we have to bring to the table. I am optimistic in the diversity of voices and in the creativity, as I mentioned, the imagination of civil society.
Great, thank you. Mora, I wonder if you have a question?
Yes, I do. Here I am. Thank you so much, Professor Mejias, for this amazing presentation. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to say two at this point. So my first question is, I mean, I do realize that you said in different occasions that, of course, the scale and the scope and the kind of violence exerted in this type of colonialism is certainly different in the one from the past. And you do acknowledge that there's a significant difference in the kinds of violence exerted. But I was wondering, how can we make sense of sort of the pleasures that come with the use of data as used by users, right? So I'm thinking, for instance, in the cases in which people, and I'm thinking about the work of Ignacio Siles, how people feel like a sort of even love connection to Spotify because they're listening to playlists that were crafted exactly for what data about them told the algorithm, right? So I'm thinking how we can make sense conceptually, but also practically speaking, about these little pleasures or joys that come with this extraction of data. That's question number one. Then question number two, perhaps related, is about the case of the use of data for the optimization of the self. So I'm thinking literally about the self-quantified movement. I'm thinking about all these cases in which people are eager to exploit their own data. I mean, at the individual level, of course, with the project of modifying themselves and their habits and their behaviors and, optimizing themselves. Thinking about health data specifically, that's one of the most important realms of the self-quantified movement, but also in terms of the consumption of culture, eating habits, I mean, everything related to the self-optimization. So have you considered this particular case? Does that transform your notion of data colonialism, or does it actually reify that? Okay, so I'm gonna stop there. I have many other questions, but I'm just gonna stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mora. Those are excellent questions. So I think, yes, the first one, speaking specifically about the pleasures of participating in this emergent order, I think that is a big difference because, I don't know if previous colonized subjects would describe their interaction with the empire in terms of pleasure, although I'm sure in some ways they did. I think that's sort of the point, that these social orders are not only punitive and disciplinary, right? I think even if we go back to Foucault, discipline and punishment, but also pleasure, because participating in these new orders is pleasurable. When I was listening to your question, I think what came immediately to mind is that, firstly, yes, we participate because we derive a benefit. Getting customized ads or being able to book Uber, it's convenient and it brings us pleasure. It's a way in which we socialize. It's a way in which we conduct our social relations with families and friends. So what's not like? It is pleasurable. I was also thinking about, for instance, the role of language in colonialism. Before the seminar started, we were all sitting there speaking in Spanish, right? The language of the colonizer. And of course, we are hybrids and mestizos, and so that's what we speak. But I think using the language of the colonizer to express, to give shape to the identity of the colonized has been a very creative, imaginative, and liberatory practice. So the fact that we can use Spanish or English or whatever to describe our situations, to give voice to these new orders, I think that's a very good point. And I think we can then think about data as a language. So we don't need to reject it. We don't need to say, I'm never going to use it. I think, as you suggest, there are ways in which we can incorporate it. We can learn how to use it. To go back to Audre Lorde's point, it's a tool. It's the master's tools that we can perhaps employ to dismantle this same oppressive structure. As far as your other question about optimizing the self, I think obviously it's related to the first, in the sense that, yes, why do we wear the Fitbit or use an app to remind us when to drink water or to exercise? Again, it's pleasurable, it provides order. I think here I do feel a little bit more fear in terms of the surveillance that enables. And even in the book, we have a whole chapter devoted to what that does to our conception of freedom. not just freedom in the sense of the Western, definition of individual freedom, but I think even other philosophers of decolonization have also thought about the same question. And the argument Nick and I make in the book is that when you have a device interfering with how you can even process or talk to yourself, when you have a Fitbit, in other words, telling you your body needs to do X, Y, and Z, then we do see that as a loss of freedom in some ways, especially when the data that's being generated is not just data that belongs to you, it's data that's going to a corporation and being used to generate profit, et cetera, et cetera. But I think just to wrap up my attempt to respond to your questions, I would go back to the image of the digital native again, because the native informant, sorry. Because again, the issue here is not that we are passive victims. The issue is not that we are, I think, being oppressed, but in a particular way, in a way in which, as you said, we derive pleasure from it, we derive benefit from using these things. And so the role of the native informant, like La Malinche, was precisely to facilitate this extractive process for our own benefit. She got something out of it, just as we get something out of it. So I don't think it's a simple dichotomy of oppressor, colonized, colonizer. I think it has always been for 500 years a very complex relationship. So I would go back to that original point to say that we are not just mere subjects in this new order. We are, in fact, informants and participants in it.
Thank you so much.
I just wanted to say that if any of our audience members wants to post a question to the chat, in the chat, then that'd be super helpful and we can get the conversation going and open it that way. Professor Wojcicki, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you, Ulises, for a fabulous, fabulous presentation. I have a question that builds on the issue of nationalization, something that Thomas already touched upon. It has to do with what you think is the role of the nation state with regards to data and data sovereignty in the global era, right? I mean, the nation state has a complicated relationship with communication technology. The work of Ben Anderson has been instrumental in teaching us that communication technologies and communication practices have had a constitutive role in terms of the nation state. And now that we are seeing changes in technology, right? How do you see, transformations in dynamics of sovereignty and in what the nation state might mean with regards to these technological formations that are global, like almost no other technological formations before in history?
Thank you, Pablo. I'm just taking some notes. I think that's an excellent question. And I think, well, firstly, I have participated in a couple of conferences where, the question of data sovereignty or technological sovereignty has come up, which apparently is becoming a little bit of a meme, especially in Europe. There's a lot of discussion about the need of the European state and the European Union to be sovereign, to not depend on China on the one hand, and on things like electronic chips or even batteries for electric vehicles, but also, of course, after the past few years, also not depend on the United States and their extractivist platforms like Facebook and Google, etc. So I think there's a lot of talk right now in Europe about the need for this kind of sovereignty. Instead of Facebook, they are saying we need a European Facebook. We need European batteries, so on and so forth. So I think that is kind of interesting, but given the context of everything that's happening, of course, these days in the world, I do fear that it can very quickly devolve in some sort of, nationalism, provincialism. It's like, yes, what we need to do right now is, like Russia, look inwards, close off the internet, have our own internet so that we can monitor dissidents and the population better. So I think in many instances, this language of sovereignty is just, it stands in for this kind of nationalistic discourses that obviously I don't see as positive. It's interesting that even now in the United States, the discourse also takes shape, obviously not in the form of abandoning Facebook, but in the sense of building clean networks. So under Trump, Mike Pompeo had put together a proposal for a clean internet. And so the idea is that, yes, the United States and its allies would commit to only using these technologies, to only using solutions provided by these corporations. Basically, what that translated into was not use Chinese products. We need to build a clean network free of Chinese, spying technologies, etc. What's interesting is that under Biden, that discourse maybe is not as forceful, but it continues. The Biden administration is continuing to think about disentangling from Chinese supplies, certain products, etc., etc. But yes, just to go to the second part of your question, how is all of this going to transform the state? I think in many ways it already has, because even though I said colonialism is a partnership between the state and the corporation, what we can see nowadays is that the state has been ceding ground to the corporations, and roles that we would traditionally associate as responsibilities of the state in terms of the collection of data had been outsourced and privatized and shifted to the private sector. So that now, yes, perhaps the state continues to do the census, but these days the states buy data from corporations because they are much better, much more efficient at generating data, at analyzing data. So that relationship has become very one-sided, and I think it benefits both the state and the corporations. But I think that's the problem, that the state has already surrendered in many ways that control and is relying on corporations to do many of those things it used to do before.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ulises, and perfectly on time, just a minute before our end time to wrap up this most enlightening seminar. I want to thank Ulises for a terrific presentation and Q&A, Tomas for great moderation, and the audience for staying with us to the end. And I invite you to next week's seminar of the Latinx Digital Media Center at Northwestern University with Lourdes Cueva Chacon of San Diego State University. Everybody have a great rest of your days.
Thank you.